Dennis Yule had lived with the truth for 33 years. For most of that time, he convinced himself it wasn't truth at all, just an unfortunate series of events that had spiraled beyond his control. He told himself he had been a contractor, a middleman, someone who followed instructions and walked away. But cancer does not negotiate. By the time Dennis Yule entered hospice care, his body had become a map of regret. His voice was weak. His hands shook constantly, and the nights were the worst, because that was when Robert Harmon came back. In his dreams, Robert was always asking the same question. Why? The call Dennis made came late at night. He did not call the police first. He did not call a lawyer. He called a number he had been given years earlier, a number connected to a federal investigator who specialized in cold cases. When Catherine Mills answered, she expected another tip that would lead nowhere. Instead, she heard a man whisper, "I was there when he disappeared." There was a long pause. Then Dennis said the name, Robert Harmon. When investigators arrived at the hospice, Dennis did not attempt to bargain. He didn't ask for immunity. He didn't ask for protection. He asked how long it had been. When Catherine told him 33 years, Dennis nodded slowly. "That's longer than I thought," he said. He admitted that for decades he had believed the truth would never matter, that Robert Harmon had already been erased, not just physically, but officially. Once the FBI labeled Robert a defector, the story hardened into fact. Dennis had counted on that. Dennis's first full admission stunned investigators. He described a white utility van parked near the rest stop that morning. Not vaguely, not approximately. He described the dent in the side panel, the missing company logo, the loose door latch that rattled when driven. It was the same van Leon Bradshaw had reported, the report that had been dismissed, the report that had been buried. Dennis confirmed it had been real and intentional. Robert Harmon had not been randomly targeted. Dennis explained that Robert had been identified weeks earlier as a problem, not aggressive, not loud, just persistent. Robert had questioned procurement data tied to Titan Aerospace. He noticed discrepancies others had ignored: inflated shipping weights, duplicated invoices, subcontractors billing for materials that never arrived. At first, management dismissed him. Then they warned him, then they escalated. Dennis named names. Not all of them would ever be made public, but one stood out: Victor Castellano, a senior executive with enough distance from day-to-day operations to claim ignorance and enough authority to ensure silence. Dennis said the instruction had been simple: make it look like he left. On the morning of his disappearance, Robert believed he was running late. He stopped at the rest area to make a quick call and stretch his legs. Dennis approached him calmly, polite, professional. He told Robert there had been reports of vehicle theft in the area and suggested checking the engine. When Robert leaned forward, hands braced on the car frame, Dennis grabbed him from behind. Robert resisted, harder than expected. Dennis admitted that was the moment he realized this was no longer a scare tactic. Robert knew. Dennis's voice broke when he described what happened next. Robert kept asking what he had done wrong. He said he would stop asking questions. He said he would transfer departments. He said he just wanted to go home. Dennis said none of that mattered anymore. Once the decision had been made, it could not be undone. Robert was forced into the back of the van, restrained, injured, still conscious. Dennis said the van drove for nearly an hour. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Inside the van, time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Dennis said Robert was breathing heavily, struggling to stay conscious. The injuries from the struggle had left him disoriented but not silent. Robert asked where they were taking him. No one answered. At one point, he said something Dennis claimed haunted him more than anything else. "My girls are waiting for me." That sentence landed with weight. Dennis admitted that for a brief moment he considered stopping the van, but fear was stronger than conscience. Fear of the people who had hired him, fear of becoming the next problem to be removed. Dennis explained that the operation had been designed to minimize risk. No weapons tied to individuals, no identifiable uniforms, no digital records. Every person involved knew only what they needed to know, and most importantly, everyone believed the FBI narrative would protect them. Once Robert Harmon was officially labeled a defector, the search changed. They were no longer looking for a victim. They were looking for motive, and that assumption shielded the crime. The van eventually turned onto a road Dennis had driven many times before, an industrial landfill on the outskirts of the city, a place designed for disappearance. Dennis said Robert was barely responsive by the time they arrived. He was still alive, still breathing. Dennis admitted he avoided looking at Robert's face during the final moments. He said it was easier that way, easier to pretend the man in front of him was not real. Robert Harmon was left beneath tons of waste, not buried with ceremony, not buried with dignity, disposed of. Investigators later confirmed Dennis's explanation. The landfill had expanded repeatedly over the decades. Entire sections had been sealed, capped, and built over. Recovery was impossible. Robert Harmon's body had become part of the landscape, lost forever. Dennis revealed how payment had been handled: cash deliveries, layered intermediaries, subcontractors who existed only on paper. The money came from Titan Aerospace funds disguised as logistics expenses. No single transaction stood out, but together they told a story of intentional erasure. Dennis explained that silence had not been enforced through threats alone. It was enforced through confidence. Confidence that no one would ever question the official explanation. Confidence that paperwork once filed became truth, and confidence that time would do the rest. People stop caring, Dennis said. They move on. For more than 3 decades, that confidence held, until Catherine Mills. Dennis said he had known the moment she reopened the van report that the lie was weakening. Old assumptions were being questioned, and assumptions were the foundation of everything. Dennis did not accuse individual agents of corruption. Instead, he described something more dangerous. Complacency. Once the defection narrative was accepted, evidence that contradicted it became inconvenient. Reports were deprioritized, witnesses were dismissed, questions were discouraged. Not out of malice, out of certainty. Dennis's confession forced the case into motion. Search warrants were issued, financial records were examined, emails that had once been ignored were reread. What investigators found confirmed everything Dennis had said. Robert Harmon had threatened Profit, and Profit had responded decisively. Victor Castellano was arrested quietly. No dramatic press conference, no public spectacle, just a man in a suit walking into a federal building. During questioning, Castellano denied authorizing harm, but emails revealed concern. Concern about delays, concern about audits, concern about Robert Harmon, concern enough to justify removal. The prosecution moved carefully. They knew the case would be scrutinized. Every detail mattered. Dennis's testimony was corroborated by financial trails, internal memos, and overlooked witness statements. The van report returned, no longer dismissed. This time it was central. The trial was held without cameras. Inside, the atmosphere was restrained, almost clinical. Robert Harmon's name was spoken repeatedly, not as a traitor, but as a victim. For the first time, the narrative changed officially. Dennis did not live to see the verdict. He died knowing he had confessed, but not knowing if it would matter. Catherine Mills later said she believed he confessed not for forgiveness, but for relief. He wanted the truth out of him before it consumed what little time he had left. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. Victor Castellano was found guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and corporate malfeasance resulting in death. There was no dramatic reaction, no outburst. Just a man nodding slightly as if acknowledging something he had known was inevitable. For decades, Castellano had trusted distance. Distance from the act, distance from the decision. Distance from responsibility. That distance collapsed in a matter of hours. At sentencing, the judge addressed the nature of the crime. This was not an act of passion, he said. It was an act of calculation. The court acknowledged that Robert Harmon's body would never be recovered, but absence, the judge noted, did not erase guilt. Victor Castellano was sentenced to decades in federal prison. No appeal could change the record. The official story had finally been corrected. Margaret Harmon did not attend sentencing. She said she had spent enough of her life in rooms waiting for answers. Instead, she read the transcript later, alone. What mattered to her was not the length of the sentence. It was the language. For the first time in 33 years, government records referred to Robert Harmon as a victim. Not a defector, not a traitor, a victim. Margaret later spoke about what the accusation had done to their family. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Doors closed quietly. Her daughters grew up hearing whispers. At school, at jobs, in background checks. The lie had consequences far beyond the crime itself. It reshaped lives. Robert Harmon's daughters were adults when the truth came out. One had chosen a career far from government work, afraid of the shadow attached to their name. The other had pursued law, driven by unanswered questions she couldn't articulate as a child. Both described growing up with an absence that never resolved. Now that absence had a shape and a cause. Following the conviction, federal agencies quietly amended internal files. The defection label was removed. Memoranda were updated, errors acknowledged. No public apology was issued, but for the Harmon family, the correction mattered. It meant Robert Harmon had not abandoned them. He had been taken from them. Titan Aerospace did not survive the investigation intact. Contracts were terminated. Executives resigned. Federal oversight increased. The company avoided total collapse, but it never regained its influence. Robert Harmon's questions had been valid and costly. In the years following the case, whistleblower protections were expanded. Internal reporting mechanisms were revised. Safeguards were strengthened, quietly, without ceremony. Robert Harmon's name was not mentioned in the policy documents. But his impact was unmistakable. There is no grave to visit, no marker, but Margaret keeps one object on her desk, a photograph taken years before the disappearance. Robert is smiling, unaware. Still believing the system he worked for would protect him. The case forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable reality. Not all disappearances are mysteries, some are solutions. Solutions to problems someone powerful wants removed. And the most effective cover is not secrecy, it is assumption. For 33 years, time protected the lie, witnesses aged, memories faded. Interest waned, but time also preserved something else, evidence, and eventually conscience. Dennis Yule's confession did not bring Robert Harmon back. But it broke the silence that had allowed the crime to exist. Catherine Mills later said the case changed how she viewed closure. "There's no such thing," she said. "There's only truth." For her, the victory was not the conviction. It was the correction of history. Robert Harmon did not set out to expose corruption. He did not imagine himself as brave. He noticed numbers that didn't add up. He asked questions others ignored, and for that he was removed. For decades, the world believed he walked away. That belief was convenient. It protected institutions, it protected profits, it protected the wrong people. Now we know what really happened. Robert Harmon didn't vanish, he was silenced. And the truth waited 33 years to be heard.